So welcome to another edition of A Dose of Science. And guess who we have back with us today? Emily, the new mommy, is back. And, well, not exactly back because we're all on Zoom. We're still not a situation yet where we can be back together, but we are at least Zooming together. So a year off, all rejuvenated, all rejuvenated, right?
It's so funny because a year off, but now I really understand that I feel like I worked very hard for this office, but I have never worked as hard this past year being a mom. It's really like 24/7 actually. Like you just don't have any time off.
And it doesn't stop.
Yeah.
It doesn't
And that's
stop.
what I hear. It doesn't stop. Yeah. No, but it was amazing. Zoe's already won and now she's at daycare, which is why I'm able to work. So yeah. Anyway, nice to be back.
Very good. Life goes on, and so far you have escaped COVID.
Yes, thank God I had
Unlike
so far.
some of us.
Right. What happened to you, Joe, last week?
Here's the evidence. Started a week ago, and symptoms now are gone. Hopefully, gone for good. I don't know where it cropped in, but it had to be in transit, I think. We're down in Dominican Republic, and everything there was outdoors and taking care. Judging by when the infection had to have been in transit, so at the airport or on the airplane.
And it's crazy because that was the one, you haven't traveled anywhere. Like you were really homebound for 2 years and you kind of decided that you were going to go and
Yeah, and no matter how careful you are, that's the thing. This is obviously so contagious that obviously, didn't wear the mask all the time on the plane, took it off to eat and drink, but that was it. But maybe that was enough. So I don't know if I've acquired some immunity now. It's it goes back and forth with this. Of course, not sure which Omicron variant I would have had, but the current information is that you're not so well protected, even with natural immunity from these variants. That people have gotten infected just a month after a previous infection.
But not with with the same variant, you think?
Well, you don't know because you don't get tested for which variant you have. But it is not conferring lifetime immunity. This much we know.
So tell us just what were your symptoms though? Like what were you feeling?
Runny nose, sore throat. The thing the most was the sore throat and inability to speak, which was something of an impediment in my line of work. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have to change anything around? Any talks or anything?
I did. Yeah. And I think it was actually the first time in 42 years that I've had to cancel something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so it happens. Still here. And Jonathan is still here, still uninfected.
As far as I know, I mean, there's always a possibility that I was asymptomatic at some point over the past 2 years, but as far as I know, I've never had it.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's hope that keeps going. And but this thing is not leaving us. So who the hell knows?
At least it's getting warmer. It's getting warmer, and we can start, being outdoors, and it's just more pleasant overall.
Let's get down to informing and entertaining the people a little bit. Let me kick it off here because I've become interested very recently in doing some extensive movie watching, especially during COVID, and movies that have some sort of scientific or medical connection. And I'm trying to put together, a compendium of these. And of course, there's a huge number. So I thought I would just bring your attention to two that I've watched over the last week, given the time of being home, that I've really enjoyed. And I think that's worth watching. They're old, but just because something is old doesn't mean it's useless. So the great moment actually came out in 1944, and it is a black and white movie. And the great moment that it celebrates is the birth of anesthesia with ether. And the movie very nicely tells the story of William Morton, the dentist who introduced ether anesthesia. And they get a lot of the details right. The story recounts how Morton was familiar with colleague Horace Wells's experiment. Wells also was a dentist who had been experimenting with nitrous oxide, and he had actually attempted to demonstrate nitrous oxide at Massachusetts General Hospital to the staff, but it became a fiasco because he didn't allow enough time for the nitrous oxide to be absorbed. And when the surgeon started to cut, the patient screamed and ran out of the operating room. This was not good for Wells's reputation. In fact, he was so devastated by this that a couple of years later ended up committing suicide. But anyway, Morton knew about this story, and he figured that there had to be a better way to induce anesthesia, a more reliable method. And he eventually concluded that ether would do the job. Now, this is where the movie distorted the facts a little bit. And as you know, you can expect they do exercise their poetic license very often in movies to make the events sound sort of more illustrious. And in the movie version, Morton actually accidentally spills a bottle of ether and in his home and falls asleep, and it is in this way that he recognizes ether as an anesthetic. Well, that didn't happen, but the preamble in the movie is that after having heard about Wells's story and thinking that there had to be a better way, he approached Professor Charles Jackson of Harvard University, who was a chemist, to ask him if he knew of any potential substance. And Jackson in the film tells him, try ethyl chloride, which would have been reasonable because ethyl chloride is known to be a local anesthetic. So there's no question that this would have been good advice. In any case, in the movie, he misunderstands the ethyl chloride, and when he goes to buy some in a store, he buys ether instead, and then takes it home, happens to accidentally spill it, and inhales the fumes, etc. This is not correct historically. Indeed, Morton did go to Jackson, but Jackson told him to try ether. The ethyl chloride connection is totally fabricated. I guess they thought that it would make it more interesting if turned out to be sort of an accidental discovery that, Morton fell asleep after spilling a bottle of ether. There was another little bit of a disturbing issue here, in that Jackson is presented as somewhat of a mad scientist, which he certainly was not. Charles Jackson was recognized as a very, very influential, knowledgeable chemist at the time. But much of the rest of the movie is very sound. Here is Morton, of course, portrayed by the actor, holding the ether inhaler that was used, together with the first patient on whom he first tried it in his dental practice. So most of it is presented very well, including the legal quagmire that ensued, because Morton wanted credit, Jackson wanted credit, Wells wanted credit. There were lawsuits back and forth over who should get credit for this discovery. And that was portrayed in the movie. But something that they left out was that 4 years prior to Morton's first use of anesthetic in 1846, 4 years early, in 1842, Dr. Crawford Long, who was a medical doctor in Georgia, had actually used ether anesthesia. And he used it on several patients and kept notes on it. The trouble was he never published, and therefore he didn't get the credit. So it really does pay to publish when you do some reputable research. Anyway, It's a very good movie. I would recommend the Great Moment. You can easily find it. You can also take a look on the web and find the classic painting of that great moment, where you can see Morton holding the ether inhaler and John Collins Warren, the surgeon, just ready to slice into a tumor on the neck of the patient. And this is all very realistic. Notice also that in those days, doctors would get dressed up in their finery to carry out operations. This was before an understanding of bacteria and antisepsis. And this took place in Massachusetts General. The room is still there. It's called the Ether Dome. And if you ever get a chance to go to Boston, it is well worthwhile to go and visit that historic site. Find the movie. You will enjoy it. I think you will also enjoy Dr. Ehrlich's Magic Bullet, another black and white movie. It came out in 1940, and it tells the story of Dr. Paul Ehrlich, who really was the inventor of antibiotics long before Alexander Fleming. And the magic bullet refers to a drug that specifically targets a disease. This was one of Edward G. Robinson's first roles, and interesting role because unlike his later roles, he did not play a criminal or a mobster of some kind. And he portrayed Dr. Paul Ehrlich extremely well. Ehrlich was a physician very much interested in research. And by this time, of course, Louis Pasteur had laid down the germ theory of disease. And in 1856, William Henry Perkin in England had accidentally discovered synthetic dyes, the classic mauve dye. And this interested Paul Ehrlich because in those days, they had a lot of trouble staining bacterial cells on the microscope slides. And he tried all kinds of dyes. And he found that there were certain dyes that had been first made by Perkin that would specifically stain bacteria. So you could put the slide under a microscope and look at the bacteria because they would be colored. Everything else would be in the background. Now, this was at a time when there was a great deal of research in bacteria. Robert Koch, who actually became a colleague of Ehrlich's, had identified the tuberculosis bacterium, for which he eventually got the Nobel Prize. And Ehrlich got very, very interested in working with communicable diseases, with bacterial diseases, and especially got interested in diphtheria. And he struck up a working relationship with Emil von Behring. And the two of them basically solved the riddle of diphtheria. Diphtheria is a bacterial disease. And the bacteria actually produce a toxin, which causes all of the symptoms. And Behring and Ehrlich found that they could isolate that bacterial toxin, inject it into horses, and the horses would then produce what they called an antitoxin. Today, we know that antitoxin is what today we would call an antibody. So they would basically inject the diphtherial toxin into the horse, isolate the horse's blood, and from that isolate what they call the antiphtheric serum, which basically were antibodies that could then be injected into someone suffering from diphtheria, and they would be cured. But that is just a sidelight in the film. The film actually focuses on Paul Ehrlich developing the world's first antibiotic, and that was arsphenamine, or salvarsan, as it was called. And it was used against syphilis and against gonorrhea very successfully. And as the story goes, it was all based on the idea that if a bacterial cell could be preferentially dyed, then perhaps if you could make that dye toxic, you could kill the bacterial cell without killing any other cells. Clever idea. And Ehrlich found a way to incorporate arsenic into the dye so that when it was introduced, the dye would gravitate towards the bacteria and kill the bacteria without killing any of the other tissues. And it turned out that that was right. But it took quite some effort to find this. And according to the legend, Ehrlich tried this 606 times before he found the actual molecule that could act as an antibiotic. That isn't exactly correct, even though it was portrayed as such in the film. They tried a series of compounds. One of those series was the 600 series, and it was the sixth drug in the 600 series. So there were not 606 different substances tried. But anyway, that makes for an interesting story. It's also interesting that they explained in the movie very, very correctly that Ehrlich worked together with Sahachiro Hata, who had come from Japan. That was quite a rare situation in those days for a Japanese researcher to be working in Germany, and he was not particularly well accepted. But there's another interesting little footnote to this story here, is that this movie was made in 1940, just as the war was getting underway. And there was a big audience for American films in Germany. And Paul Ehrlich was Jewish. And the Germans in the 1930s had done absolutely everything to wipe his name away from records, from films, as if he had never existed, giving him no credit whatsoever for having discovered this life-changing drug. And there was a lot of controversy about whether or not his Jewish heritage would be played up in the movie. And they decided that because they were looking for success in Germany with the film, they had to downplay that, which they did. So there's really no reference to his heritage in the movie. And it was released in 1940 when the Nazis, of course, were already in power. And there was a lot of controversy about this, that the movie did not pay enough homage to his cultural background. Anyway, in 1908, Paul Ehrlich eventually won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of salvarsan. And he got it at the same year that Metchnikov got the Nobel Prize. And Metchnikov, of course, was the Russian who did so much work on bacteria and probiotics. And of course, for our interest, Ernest Rutherford, who did much of his work here at McGill, received the Physics Nobel Prize in 1908. All right, well, just to finish off, I'm going to recommend a new series to you guys. This is Dr. Death. And it's very, very current. It tells the very, very interesting story. This is, I think, what we would call a docudrama. So it is based on a real story, but it is with actors. And Dr. Christian Dunch is portrayed. And he is sort of a rogue surgeon with some very, very bizarre ideas. And his hand dexterity is not very good. He injures a lot of patients. He gets drunk. He uses drugs. He even operates on an old friend of his, trying to solve his back problems, and leaves him in a wheelchair.
Oh my gosh.
It's an amazing story. Amazing story. And eventually he was taken to court. And he is now in prison with a life sentence, the first time that a physician has been convicted on criminal charges for actions in the course of their medical work, which is very, very
I never even heard of the show, and it looks amazing. Jonathan, have you heard of it?
It is amazing. Yeah. I think
Jonathan, have you seen it?
I haven't seen the TV show, but this is based on a podcast that I did listen to where an investigative reporter looks at those cases and how much time, how much inaction there was, because there were a lot of reports about what this guy was botching surgeries left and right,
all over the place. And
it took a while before the hospitals and people started to be like, yeah, maybe we should do something about this.
I guess because sometimes you could have like a random botch, which is no excuse. But once you start to see, and hospitals will, I guess, try and cover that up. But when there's a pattern, Wow, that's a very good cast, and that looks like that could be my next.
Oh,
that would be my next show.
He lied about his background. He got away with lots of stuff.
Wow.
Oh, and incidentally, also, of course, the Elizabeth Holmes story is out now.
Right.
Dropout, which is
it's gotten a lot of very good reviews. I haven't seen it yet.
Yes, I just saw the first episode. Actually, I saw the first episode last night, and in the first episode, I mean, she was not portrayed as a rogue. But this was her early years, and
wait, keep watching. I imagine,
yeah. But she was portrayed as someone who was driven to really make an earth-shaking discovery. Yeah, but anyway, it's very interesting. Jonathan, have you seen that Dropout?
No, but I read the book Bad Blood, which I reviewed for our website, and a fantastic investigation by John Carreyrou, and it's just when you think it can't get any worse, it does. So the story itself is bigger than, I mean, it really happened, but it feels like fiction because of just how much she was hiding to prove what she wanted to accomplish, and how many influential people that she roped in and who believed in her and gave her money. I mean, it's fantastic.
Well, that's a lot of the themes out there, like these con people, right? Like there's the Dropout, there's Inventing Anna, which is also, again, bringing in people and really making them believe you.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, at least from the film version so far, it isn't clear whether she actually thought in the beginning that she had something legitimate, or it was just a total con from the beginning.
From the book that I read, it seems like she really thought she could pull this off. And when early evidence showed that she couldn't, she just kept hiding it until she could get to the point where she could really figure this out. So it seems like she was initially genuine, but then she started to do things that were just unethical and illegal in order to buy herself some time.
But did she really think that she had a machine that could do this?
Well, she thought that she could get a machine that would do
yes. I know
from one single drop of blood, that she could run so many different tests.
Right.
And so I mean, again, we'll never know what was really inside of her brain all this time and what her motivation was, but it seems like she thought she could pull it off with the right people. And when she couldn't, she just doubled down and I mean, she would buy commercial machines that existed and had those tests run on those machines, and making people believe that it was her new machine that was running those tests when it wasn't.
Anyway, she's waiting to be sentenced now.
I believe so, yes. I believe
it's a long wait, and I think she's gotten married in the meantime.
I
think so.
And she has a kid now, I think.
She has a kid, yeah.
Yeah, and there was some worry that she would pull the mother card at trial to sort of
Fascinating story.
Indeed.
All right, Jonathan, let's go on with your fascinating story.
Yeah, I want to talk about a phenomenon. There we go. I want to talk about a fascinating phenomenon that will also take us to the 1800s, but also in today's time, which is called aphantasia. But first, let's go back to the 1800s. Let's talk about Friedrich August Kekulé, who was a German organic chemist. And he was interested in a particular molecule called benzene. And at the time, chemists knew the number of atoms that were in benzene, but they just didn't know how they were structured. Right? So what was the shape that benzene had? And Kekulé is the one who figured it out. And the way that he tells the story, I mean, who knows if this is exactly what happened, if there were some embellishments along the way.
Yeah, well, he told that story many times in different ways. Sometimes with monkeys, sometimes a snake biting his tail.
Okay, so I found one of his speeches in which he tells it one way. And so the way that he told it at that time was that he was sort of drifting. He was sitting in front of this fireplace and his mind was drifting. And he was kind of daydreaming, and he suddenly he had this vision of the Ouroboros, of the serpent biting its own tail. And that gave him the idea that maybe that was a structure of benzene, that it was actually a ring of carbon atoms all linked together. And that is indeed what the structure of benzene is. So he had this sort of this image pop into his head, and that gave him the idea that maybe that was the structure of this particular chemical. Now this image happened inadvertently, right? Involuntarily. And so the question is, could he have conjured up this image in his brain? And the answer is probably, but maybe not. Because I want all of our viewers right now to close their eyes and to imagine an apple. And what is happening right now, which you can't tell, is that some people really can't do it, and they're wondering why I'm asking them to do this. And other people can do it, and they're wondering, well, I mean, of course I can do this. What do you mean? And this story basically went a little bit viral on Twitter a few months ago because somebody asked this question on Twitter and asked people to reply. Do you see it as number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? So number 1 is this photorealistic apple that you can visualize in your brain. Number 2, it's slightly more simplistic. 3, there's no color. 4, it's out of focus, it's blurry. And 5, there's just nothing there. And what was fascinating was to see the surprise and the emotional investment of the people who were replying, because there were people who obviously could do it and were shocked to learn that some people could not do this. And it was saying, well, how can you not? And then the people who couldn't were equally shocked and saying, well, how can you? How are you? And somebody wrote, it's like conjuring images from the ether, like sorcerers. How are you doing this? So this is a fascinating phenomenon. We've known about this for a long time. It just didn't have a name until very recently. And in fact, Sir Francis Galton, who was a preeminent scientist, who was related to Charles Darwin, he heard about this while speaking to some scientist friends of his. And he did this informal survey of colleagues that he had and reported that about 6% of them, so a very small minority, could not, by their own admission, voluntarily conjure up mental images. Nowadays, we don't really have great numbers on how prevalent this is because the studies have still been quite small, but it seems to affect a small minority of people. And it's funny because you may not know that you have this, and you may not know that there are other people out there who can do it or who can't do it. And so people with this thing called aphantasia, they figure this out in a variety of funny ways. And there are message boards where people reveal how they learned about this. And so somebody was saying, oh, I was listening to this guided meditation, right? And the narrator asked me to picture a sphere. And I was like, what do you mean, picture a sphere? So that's when they realized it was something bizarre about them. Somebody else might suffer from insomnia and be told to count the sheep and be very puzzled. What do you mean count? Well, just imagine sheep and count them. What do you mean imagine? I can't visualize sheep. Or it might be a couple having a conversation about what somebody was wearing, a year ago. And then, she says she was wearing a red dress, and her boyfriend says, well, how do you remember that? Well, I can see her. I remember what she was wearing. I can see this in my mind's eye. What do you mean you can see her in her red dress? So lots of interesting and funny ways on how people figure out that they have this thing. And this thing is called aphantasia, which literally means absence of imagination. Of course, that's not what it actually means, but that's what the word is referring to. And again, we've known about this since at least the Victorian era, if not before that. But it's only in 2015 that it finally got a name. It was a bunch of researchers in the UK who finally gave it this name. And what it is a condition of reduced or absent voluntary imagery. The people who have it in the scientific literature, they're referred to as aphantasics. In the popular press, I've seen aphantasiacs, which I think is a much, much better name. And an interesting thing to say about aphantasia is that people who have aphantasia can still involuntarily see things in their mind's eye. So they can dream, or they can see things in their dreams. Mm-hmm. That's fine. They can also, if they're in conversation with somebody and that person talks about a place that they're familiar with, they may be hit with this mental image of what this place looks like. But if you ask them to voluntarily, imagine this object in their mind's eye, that's what they can't do. They either can't do it well or can't do it at all.
So it's more like on command. Like I'm trying to think, yes. Like, is it so I know it's like it's not a new phenomenon, but it sounds like it's kind of got like more traction in recent years with the name and everything. But like, is it linked to memory? Is it linked to tests, like testing? Like how do they, like mnemonic devices, or are those people able to, or it's really just upon like, do that, like, can you recall this, you know?
So it's very interesting because as I'll get to it in the end, there are ways for the brain to compensate. And so when these people are tested in sort of visuospatial skills, right? So it's kind of like seeing I don't know, like a triangle or a cylinder in your mind's eye and twisting it around and figuring some things out. They can do it, even though they can't literally visualize this thing. So there are ways for the brain to compensate for this. But to your point, when they're asked to voluntarily conjure up an image, either it looks super blurry, like the apple there, or there's just nothing there. It's just blackness. They cannot do it, which is again, it's shocking for those of us who can do it, because we can't imagine what it would be like to not be able to do it, and for them, it's equally shocking.
And then to almost have like, I don't want to say it because it sounds not nice, but like to have no like an absence of imagination. Like so much is, when you think about kids, imaginary friends, and then like, you know, just to have, I know, like they entertain themselves and they have a great imagination. Like it's you know, and so to not have that.
You know, again, it is important to highlight that even though the term literally means lack of absence of imagination, that's not what it is. Imagination is a much broader term, and the ability to visualize an object is one tiny part of that.
Yes.
So some people have been actually quite skeptical that aphantasia is a real thing, and they believe that maybe these people, they can visualize, they're just not aware of it. Maybe because, you know, it is difficult sometimes to define mental phenomena, right? And so maybe they think, well, maybe they can visualize, they just don't have the words for it, they can't really pin it down. And so this has been tested. And the way that you test this is by showing the eyes two different images. Right. So on the left, you will see an example of what the setup looks like. So you have a person in front of a monitor. They're at the same distance as every other participant in the study. So you rest your chin on a chin rest. You make sure you're at the same distance. There's a little sort of line in front of your nose there. And your left eye is receiving one image and your right eye is receiving a different image. And what they did in this particular experiment is, as you can see on the right, is that they showed participants their left eye, they showed them these vertical green lines, and they showed the right eye these horizontal red lines. And when your eyes are getting different visual stimuli like this, your brain doesn't quite know what to make of this. And so it keeps shifting from one to the other. And at the end, when you ask a person, what did you see? You might as well flip a coin. Half of the people will say, I saw some red lines. Half people will say, I saw a green line. The reason why this was used for aphantasia is that you can skew the results based on visualization. So what they did in the experiment is quite clever, is that first of all, they asked the person, okay, so I want you to think of a series of green vertical lines, right? So close your eyes and visualize these lines. Then they did the experiment. They showed the left eye the green lines. They showed the right eye the red lines. And then they asked them, what did you see the most? And that's when they saw a skew. More people reported seeing these green lines because their brain had been primed for them by visualizing them beforehand. So that happened with people without aphantasia, this priming of saying, imagine those lines. It skews what they perceive when we show each eye different lines. But that didn't happen with the people with aphantasia. Right? So they could not visualize those green lines. And so at the end, when they were asked, what did you see? 50% said green, 50% said red. There was no skewing. So it really looks like this is very real. Some people just cannot visualize things in their mind's eye on demand. Now, is that a problem? Is that a deficit? So I want to talk about this guy. Emily, do you know who this is? There's a bit of a...
Yeah, because I just remember your art. I see the little hint in the back, but I remember your article that you wrote about it on the site. But go ahead. Yeah.
So this is Ed Catmull. He's a former president of Pixar and Walt Disney Animation Studios, and he has aphantasia. So he came out of the aphantasia closet a few years ago, and he said, "Hey, I have a blind mind's eye." And when he realized that, he actually asked his former employees and realized that, yeah, some of his employees, some of these animators, some of the world's best animators also have aphantasia. And again, this idea of like, how do you figure this out? For him, he was trying to perform Tibetan meditation with a colleague. He was asked to visualize something. He was like, what do you mean? And then he realized he had this thing called aphantasia. On the right here is Glenn Keane. So if you saw the movie The Little Mermaid from Disney back in the 90s, I think it was, he's the one who created the design for Ariel, The Little Mermaid. So it started as just a bunch of lines, and he refined it, and eventually he found the form that they ended up using in that movie. And again, he cannot visualize. So he could not see Ariel fully formed in his mind's eye and then drew her out. He worked with the paper and until she kind of emerged from those drawings. The guy on the left is a co-founder of Mozilla. So if you use Firefox as your web browser, it's a product of Mozilla. He also has Aphantasia. On the right is Craig Venter, who's a very controversial biologist. He created the first synthetic organism in the lab. So he synthesized DNA from scratch, and that gave life to this microscopic organism. He was also in the running for the sequencing of the whole human genome. He was part of that effort. So he also has Aphantasia. So all of those people could very easily be described as being very successful, right? Especially in fields that require creativity, and yet they have Aphantasia. And so the conclusion to all of this is that this Professor Zeman, who is one of the UK researchers who named Aphantasia and who is one of the few people doing research into Aphantasia right now, he says, it is really helpful for people to know that the way they visualize or not does not define them. Again, there are compensatory mechanisms in the brain, so you can still be successful. There's so much diversity of how a brain can be wired. And we may think that something is absolutely essential for a certain task, but if you don't have it, your brain can sometimes find ways around that. So even if you have aphantasia, you can actually be a successful designer. So there you go.
That's amazing. And your brain compensates in another extremely successful creative ways.
I thought you were leading up to the movie Fantasia being made. People who suffer from aphantasia.
It would be interesting if one of the animators on Fantasia had aphantasia.
Right.
That's my
I got to tell you a final.
Felt differently.
This was triggered by your reference to Kekulé.
Okay.
In chemistry, we normally draw benzene like this, which each corner representing carbon atom and the lines representing bonds. And in 1964, I remember this very well. I was in high school. And we had been doing some very rudimentary chemistry, including drawing of diagrams. We didn't understand it. Our teacher didn't really understand it. That was Burping Bill Cook was his name. And anyway, in 1964, the Automass Chemistry building opened, the building that I'm sitting in right now. And there was some sort of opening ceremony where they had displays in the lobby of students doing research or whatever. So Burping Bill comes back and he tells us that he had discovered that he had been teaching us wrong, that the structure of benzene wasn't that, because he had seen a display in the lobby of the chemistry building, and it was really this.
I knew this was coming.
and then came the magical moment, which I remember so well. A guy sitting in the back, and I remember his name was Jack Kantrowitz, and he said, "But Mr. Cook, I don't understand, because if I just tilt my head like this, I see that." And Burping Bill was incapable of explaining this mystery.
Maybe Burping Bill had aphantasia and he could not visualize the ring and turn it around to see that it was the same one.
Yeah. Anyway, that memory was triggered by the Kekulé reference.
Right.
And we didn't do anything then in chemistry except name compounds and draw diagrams of laboratory setups, which we never did. We never did in the lab. All right, so that's it. Hopefully we've informed and entertained the public once more. And that's it. Happy Easter, happy Passover to everyone out there.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.